December 1476. Somewhere in the frozen forest near Bucharest, one of history's most feared rulers is about to meet his end. Not in the grand battle he had envisioned, not surrounded by loyal guards, but alone, betrayed, and desperate in the darkness of a Romanian winter. Vlad III of Wallachia, the man history knows as Vlad the Impaler, had just led what would be his final military campaign. The ruler who had terrorized the Ottoman Empire for decades, who had impaled thousands of enemies on wooden stakes, who had inspired centuries of vampire legends, was now trapped in circumstances entirely beyond his control. But how exactly did the most feared man in Eastern Europe die? Was he cut down by Ottoman soldiers in honest combat? Was he assassinated by his own men who had grown tired of his brutal rule? Or did something far more sinister occur in those dark woods, something that would explain why his death remains shrouded in mystery even today? The truth is more disturbing than any legend, because Vlad the Impaler's death wasn't just the end of a tyrant, it was the culmination of a conspiracy that had been months in the making, involving some of the most powerful men in his own government, and it happened at the exact moment when he finally realized that everyone he trusted had been planning his destruction. To understand the horror of how Vlad died, we need to understand how completely he had been betrayed by the winter of 1476. By November 1476, Vlad the Impaler was living in a nightmare of his own making. The third time he had reclaimed the throne of Wallachia would also be his last, because the very men who had helped him regain power were already planning his elimination. What makes this betrayal particularly chilling is that it wasn't a spontaneous rebellion. It was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had been developing for months. The boyars, Wallachia's noble class, had welcomed Vlad back with smiles and pledges of loyalty. They had provided the military support he needed to reclaim his throne, they had attended his councils, and they had sworn sacred oaths of allegiance. But behind closed doors, they were holding secret meetings with Ottoman agents, negotiating the terms of Vlad's betrayal with the same methodical precision that a merchant might use to arrange a business transaction. The scope of this conspiracy was breathtaking. This wasn't just a handful of disgruntled nobles plotting in dark corners. This was a coordinated effort involving dozens of the most powerful families in Wallachia. Men who controlled castles, armies, and trade routes had all agreed that Vlad's reign needed to end, and they had been working with Ottoman intelligence officers to determine exactly when and how to strike most effectively. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II had learned from their previous encounters with Vlad. The Sultan no longer wanted to risk massive military campaigns against a ruler who specialized in guerrilla warfare and psychological terror. Previous attempts to destroy Vlad through direct military action had proven costly and embarrassing, particularly after his famous night attack on the Sultan's own camp in 1462. Instead, they had developed a more sophisticated strategy. They would let Vlad's own people destroy him from within. The Ottoman intelligence network operating in Wallachia during 1476 was extensive and professionally managed. These weren't crude spies gathering random information. They were experienced operatives running a comprehensive psychological warfare campaign designed to corrupt Vlad's government from within. They offered the boyars something more valuable than gold or territory. They offered them survival in a world where opposing Ottoman expansion had become increasingly futile. The financial incentives were substantial. Ottoman agents arrived with chests of gold and promises of expanded trade privileges. But the real persuasion came through more subtle means. Detailed intelligence about Ottoman military capabilities, demonstrations of the empire's administrative efficiency, and carefully crafted arguments about the inevitability of Ottoman dominance in the region. The boyars were being sold not just on betrayal, but on the idea that betrayal was actually the patriotic choice that would save Wallachia from total destruction. By autumn 1476, the conspiracy had reached critical mass. The boyars weren't just passively waiting for an opportunity to betray Vlad, they were actively creating that opportunity. Every military decision he made was being reported to Ottoman commanders within hours. Every diplomatic communication was being intercepted and analysed by enemy intelligence officers. Every weakness in his defences was being catalogued and exploited by men who had sworn to protect those very defences. The psychological manipulation was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire operation. The conspirators had begun feeding Vlad intelligence that was designed to make him believe that aggressive military action was his only option for survival. They wanted him to launch a winter campaign, not because they thought it would succeed, but because they knew it would place him in the exact position they needed to eliminate him safely and with plausible deniability. The pressure on Vlad during these months must have been extraordinary. He was surrounded by men he couldn't trust, receiving reports he couldn't verify, and making decisions based on information that may have been deliberately falsified by his own advisors. Every day brought new signs that his position was deteriorating, but he couldn't identify the source of the problem because the source was sitting at his own council table, offering advice and expressing concern for his welfare. What makes this period particularly tragic is that Vlad almost certainly suspected what was happening. His previous experiences with boyar betrayal had taught him that their loyalty was always conditional, and he had survived 2 previous overthrows by assuming the worst about everyone around him. But by 1476, his options were so limited that he had no choice but to rely on men he knew were probably planning his destruction. He needed their military resources, their local knowledge, and their administrative capabilities to maintain even the pretense of effective government. The trap was closing with mathematical precision, and everyone involved knew it, except perhaps Vlad himself, who still believed he could fight his way out of an impossible situation through the same combination of audacity and brutality that had served him in the past. December 1476 brought the crisis that the conspirators had been carefully orchestrating for months. Intelligence reports began flooding into Vlad's court describing Ottoman military movements across the Danube River. These reports painted a picture of an imminent invasion that would overwhelm Wallachian defences unless immediate and decisive action was taken to disrupt enemy preparations. What Vlad didn't know was that many of these intelligence reports had been crafted by the same boyars who were sitting in his war councils, advising him on how to respond to threats they had helped create. The Ottoman military movements were real, but they were also deliberately designed to provoke exactly the response that would place Vlad in maximum personal danger while serving the conspirators' ultimate objectives. The boyar conspirators had spent months studying Vlad's psychological patterns and strategic preferences with the same attention to detail that a hunter might use to study the behaviour of dangerous prey. They knew that when faced with overwhelming odds, he would always choose aggressive action over defensive measures. They knew that his pride would never allow him to appear weak or indecisive in front of subordinates whose loyalty he was already questioning. Most importantly, they knew that he would prefer to strike first rather than wait for his enemies to complete their preparations, even if striking first meant accepting significant personal risk. The December War Council that would effectively seal Vlad's fate was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as strategic planning. The boyars presented intelligence suggesting that the Ottoman force positioned near the border was smaller and more vulnerable than it actually was. They recommended an immediate attack, arguing passionately that delay would only allow the enemy to strengthen their position and potentially coordinate with other Ottoman units in the region. The conspirators volunteered their own men for the proposed campaign, demonstrating what appeared to be enthusiastic support for their prince's military leadership. They praised his previous tactical innovations and expressed confidence that his personal presence on the battlefield would inspire the kind of aggressive performance that had made Wallachian forces famous throughout Europe. But they also subtly shaped the tactical planning in ways that would maximize Vlad's personal exposure to danger. They suggested pursuit tactics that would inevitably separate him from the main army during combat operations. They recommended aggressive follow-up operations that would take the entire force into difficult terrain where command and control would be nearly impossible to maintain. They volunteered to provide guides and scouts who were actually working for Ottoman intelligence. Most crucially, they ensured that the men who would be closest to Vlad during the most dangerous phases of the campaign were individuals whose loyalty to the conspiracy was absolute, and whose commitment to his elimination was unquestionable. The manipulation extended beyond tactical planning into the realm of personal psychology. The conspirators played upon Vlad's deepest fears and strongest motivations with surgical precision. They reminded him of his father's assassination and his brother's betrayal, suggesting that aggressive action was the only way to avoid similar fates. They appealed to his sense of duty to protect Wallachian independence, arguing that a preemptive strike was essential to preserve everything he had fought to build. They also exploited his growing paranoia about internal enemies by presenting the proposed campaign as a test of loyalty that would reveal which boyars could be trusted and which needed to be eliminated. The irony, of course, was that the men making these arguments were the very internal enemies he feared, and they were using his suspicion of others to manipulate him into the exact situation they needed to destroy him. Vlad's decision to launch the December campaign was presented to him as his own strategic choice, based on objective military analysis, but it was actually the culmination of months of careful psychological manipulation by men who understood his personality better than he understood it himself. Every piece of information he used to make his decision had been filtered through advisors who wanted him dead. Every tactical option he considered had been shaped by men who were working for his enemies. The most chilling aspect of this manipulation was its intimate nature. These weren't distant enemies or foreign agents exploiting abstract weaknesses. These were men who had known Vlad for years, who understood his personal history, his private fears, and his deepest motivations. Some of them had served under his father and had watched him grow from a boy into a ruler. Their betrayal was not just political. It was a profound violation of personal trust that went to the very core of medieval concepts of honor, loyalty, and feudal obligation. As Vlad prepared for what would be his final campaign, he was surrounded by men who were already planning the details of his funeral. His military advisors were in regular communication with enemy commanders. His personal guards included individuals who had been specifically recruited for potential assassination duties. Even his scouts and intelligence officers were reporting to Ottoman handlers who were coordinating every aspect of the trap that was about to close around him. The December campaign that would claim Vlad the Impaler's life began exactly as the conspirators had planned, with deceptive success that would lure him deeper into their carefully prepared trap. His forces achieved complete tactical surprise against the Ottoman positions, and the initial engagement appeared to validate every piece of intelligence that had prompted the operation. Ottoman soldiers were killed or scattered, their field commander was eliminated, and for a brief, euphoric moment it seemed as though Vlad's aggressive strategy had once again proven its effectiveness against impossible odds. But this victory was an illusion carefully crafted by the very men who were about to betray him. The Ottoman force had been positioned and equipped exactly as the Boyar conspirators had promised their handlers. The enemy soldiers who died in the initial attack were genuine casualties, but their deaths served the conspiracy's purposes by providing the credible combat action needed to justify what would follow. The incomplete nature of the victory, with significant numbers of Ottoman soldiers escaping into nearby forests, was not an accident of war but a deliberate feature of the trap. The Boyar conspirators immediately seized upon the partial nature of the victory to argue for the pursuit operations they knew would place Vlad in mortal danger. They pointed out with apparent military logic that allowing any enemies to escape would invite immediate retaliation and potentially compromise the entire operation. They argued that the victory needed to be made complete through aggressive follow-up actions that would eliminate every surviving enemy soldier and demonstrate Wallachian military superiority beyond any question. Vlad, whose entire military philosophy was built around achieving decisive victories through relentless aggression, agreed to pursue the surviving Ottoman forces into the dense forest near Bucharest. This decision was presented to him as tactical necessity based on sound military principles, but it was actually the activation of the final phase of the assassination plan that had been months in preparation. The pursuit took Vlad's forces into terrain that had been specifically chosen by the conspirators for its tactical advantages, from their perspective, not his. Dense forests would negate the cavalry superiority that had given Wallachian forces their edge in previous campaigns. The thick tree cover would limit visibility and make accurate assessment of tactical situations nearly impossible. Most importantly for the conspirators' purposes, the difficult terrain would create the kind of confusion and communication breakdown that could provide perfect cover for the accidents they were planning to arrange. As the Wallachian forces moved deeper into the forests, the careful organisation and clear command structure that had characterised the initial attack began to dissolve into exactly the kind of chaos that medieval armies always feared. Units became separated from their immediate commanders as they navigated between trees and around natural obstacles. Communication between different parts of the army became sporadic and unreliable, as messengers lost their way or were delayed by difficult terrain. The clear chain of command that had existed during the first phase of the operation gradually dissolved into a confused network of small groups operating independently and often without clear objectives. But this chaos was not entirely the result of natural causes or battlefield confusion. The Boyar conspirators had positioned their most trusted agents in key positions throughout the army, and these men began implementing predetermined plans designed to maximize confusion and isolation. Orders were deliberately misunderstood or conveniently delayed in transmission. Critical information about enemy positions and friendly unit locations was withheld or deliberately distorted. Units that should have been supporting each other found themselves operating in isolation, cut off from reinforcement and unable to coordinate their actions effectively. The pursuit operations that had begun as a coordinated military action gradually degenerated into a series of small unit engagements scattered throughout several square miles of dense forest. Individual commanders lost contact with their superiors and began making independent tactical decisions based on incomplete and often inaccurate information. The fog of war, always a factor in medieval combat, became so thick that it was often impossible to distinguish between friend and enemy, between deliberate action and accidental confusion. Vlad found himself increasingly isolated from the main body of his army, accompanied only by a shrinking group of personal retainers whose loyalty was becoming literally a matter of life and death. In medieval warfare, this kind of isolation was always dangerous for any high-value target, but for Vlad it was particularly perilous because he couldn't be certain which of his remaining companions were genuine protectors and which might be potential assassins waiting for the perfect moment to complete their assigned missions. The forest fighting created ideal conditions for the elimination of an inconvenient ruler through methods that would be impossible to investigate or prosecute after the fact. In the confusion of combat, with visibility limited by trees and winter weather, almost any cause of death could be explained as a legitimate combat casualty. A military leader could be struck down by enemy action, friendly fire, or deliberate assassination, and surviving witnesses might never be able to determine which explanation was accurate. The psychological pressure on Vlad during these hours must have been extraordinary, not just the normal stress of combat command, but the growing realization that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The tactical developments weren't following the patterns his experience had taught him to expect. His subordinates were behaving in ways that seemed inconsistent with their training and previous performance. Most disturbing of all, he was beginning to suspect that the very men he depended on for protection and accurate information might be working against him. As darkness began to fall on that December day, Vlad the Impaler was moving through forests that had become a maze of potential death traps carefully prepared by his own allies. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier or a boyar assassin. Every companion could be a genuine protector or a traitor waiting for the right moment to strike. Every decision about which direction to move or which group of men to trust could be his last. The man who had built his reputation on being able to see through deception and anticipate betrayal before it could harm him was now operating in an environment where deception was total and betrayal was universal. He was no longer hunting Ottoman survivors. He was being systematically hunted by forces he couldn't identify, couldn't trust, and increasingly couldn't escape. The exact moment of Vlad the Impaler's death has been deliberately obscured by the men who orchestrated it, but the available evidence suggests something far more sinister than the heroic combat death described in official accounts. What we know is that sometime during the evening hours of that December day in 1476, in the dense forest near Bucharest, the most feared ruler in Eastern Europe was killed under circumstances that his own supporters immediately began working to conceal. The official accounts of Vlad's death, produced by the same boyars who had conspired against him, tell a carefully sanitized story of heroic leadership and tragic military necessity. According to these versions, Vlad died while leading a charge against Ottoman soldiers who had been cornered in the forest, struck down by enemy weapons while fighting courageously for Wallachian independence and Christian values against Islamic expansion. But the evidence suggests a much darker and more complex reality. Multiple sources, when analysed carefully, indicate that Vlad's death occurred when his small group of remaining companions encountered what appeared to be Ottoman soldiers positioned in a clearing deep in the forest. The encounter began as what seemed like a routine combat engagement, but quickly deteriorated into something much more chaotic and fundamentally suspicious. According to the most detailed accounts, the fatal sequence of events began when Vlad's group, consisting of fewer than 20 men, discovered what appeared to be a small Ottoman unit that had taken defensive positions in the forest. The enemy soldiers seemed to be waiting for them, positioned in ways that suggested they had advanced knowledge of Vlad's route and timing, information that could only have come from sources within his own command structure. Vlad, consistent with his lifelong pattern of aggressive leadership, immediately ordered a direct assault on the enemy position. But as his men moved forward to engage, the tactical situation began to develop in ways that violated every principle of medieval combat that Vlad understood. Instead of the kind of desperate defense that would be expected from cornered soldiers, the enemy seemed to be maneuvering in coordination with some of Vlad's own men, creating patterns of movement that made no tactical sense unless viewed as components of a carefully orchestrated ambush. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the behaviour of Vlad's own companions during the critical moments of combat. Instead of the kind of protective coordination that would be expected when a beloved leader was under direct attack, there are indications of hesitation, confusion, and what can only be described as deliberate abandonment. Men who should have been covering Vlad's flanks or providing immediate support seemed to be positioned in ways that would prevent his escape, rather than facilitate his survival. Some sources suggest that the fatal blow came when Vlad, realizing that the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, attempted to withdraw from the immediate combat zone. But instead of finding the supporting positions that should have been occupied by his own men, he found himself isolated and surrounded by enemies who seemed to know exactly where he would attempt to go and exactly how he would attempt to escape. The most sinister possibility, supported by several historical sources, is that the Ottoman soldiers who delivered the killing blow were actually disguised boyar agents who had been positioned in the forest specifically for this purpose. Medieval warfare included many documented examples of soldiers wearing enemy uniforms or insignia to create confusion and provide cover for operations that would otherwise be considered treasonous. The boyar conspirators certainly had the resources, motivation, and tactical knowledge necessary to arrange such an elaborate deception. If this scenario is accurate, then Vlad's death was not a combat casualty, or even a conventional assassination, but rather a carefully orchestrated execution carried out under perfect cover by men who had spent months positioning themselves to deliver the killing blow at the moment and location of their choosing. The forest encounter was not an accidental meeting with enemy forces, but the final act of a conspiracy that had been planned down to the smallest operational detail. The immediate aftermath of Vlad's death provides additional evidence that his killing had been predetermined rather than accidental. Rather than the chaos and confusion that would normally follow the unexpected death of a medieval commander in active combat, there was an almost immediate reorganization of forces and communications that suggested extensive prior planning and preparation. Orders were issued with suspicious speed and precision. Chains of command were established or re-established according to plans that seemed to have been prepared in advance. Most tellingly, political and military communications were initiated with Ottoman forces and with the capital that could not have been improvised in the immediate aftermath of a combat engagement. The men who had been with Vlad when he died seemed to know exactly what they were supposed to do next, and exactly who they were supposed to contact to report the success of their mission. Even more suspicious was the immediate handling of Vlad's body after his death. According to multiple accounts, his head was severed from his corpse within minutes of his death and prepared for preservation and transport. This kind of rapid, professional mutilation of a royal corpse requires specific tools, preservation materials, and technical knowledge that would not normally be available on a medieval battlefield unless they had been brought there for exactly this purpose. The decapitation was not just a practical necessity for proving Vlad's death to distant Ottoman authorities. It was a symbolic act that demonstrated the complete triumph of his enemies and the total destruction of everything he had represented. The man who had become infamous throughout Europe for impaling his enemies on wooden stakes was now being reduced to a trophy that would be displayed in the Ottoman capital as proof that resistance to Islamic expansion was not just futile, but ultimately self-destructive. The men who claimed to have witnessed Vlad's death were remarkably consistent in their accounts of what had happened, but their consistency was itself suspicious. In the chaos and confusion of medieval forest combat, eyewitness accounts were normally contradictory and confused, with different observers providing conflicting details about timing, positions, and specific actions. The fact that the witnesses to Vlad's death were able to provide coherent, coordinated narratives that supported each other without obvious contradictions suggests that they had rehearsed their stories in advance and were working from a prepared script. The speed and coordination of events following Vlad the Impaler's assassination revealed the true scope and sophistication of the conspiracy that had destroyed him. Within hours of his death in the forest near Bucharest, a comprehensive political and military reorganization was already underway, a transformation so complete and well coordinated that it could only have been planned months in advance by people with detailed knowledge of Wallachian governmental and military structures. The army that had followed Vlad into the forests began dissolving almost immediately after news of his death spread through the scattered units, but this dissolution followed patterns that were anything but spontaneous. Rather than the chaotic collapse that would normally follow the unexpected death of a medieval commander, the process was carefully managed by officers who seemed to know exactly what they were supposed to do, when they were supposed to do it, and who they were supposed to coordinate with to ensure smooth transitions. Units that had been personally loyal to Vlad were systematically disbanded, with their soldiers either absorbed into other formations controlled by the conspirators or sent home with clear instructions about their future conduct and explicit warnings about the consequences of attempting to avenge their former leader. Officers who might have posed a threat to the new political arrangement were quietly arrested, reassigned to harmless positions, or simply disappeared during the confusion of the military reorganization. Weapons, supplies, and financial resources were redistributed according to predetermined plans that demonstrated intimate knowledge of Wallachian military logistics and administrative procedures. The conspirators knew exactly where critical supplies were stored, which units controlled the most valuable equipment, and how to transfer military assets without creating the kind of disruption that might attract unwanted attention from neighbouring powers or potential domestic opponents. Most revealing of all, the boyars who had accompanied Vlad on his final campaign were immediately able to establish communication with Ottoman commanders, with political leaders in the capital, and with European diplomatic representatives. These communications were not the desperate negotiations of men trying to save themselves after an unexpected disaster. They were the systematic activation of prearranged agreements that had been negotiated weeks or months earlier through intermediaries who had been working to coordinate the post-assassination political settlement. The handling of Vlad's corpse revealed the international dimensions of the conspiracy and the extent to which his death had been planned as a coordinated intelligence operation rather than a spontaneous act of rebellion. According to multiple historical sources, his head was not only severed immediately after his death, but was also professionally preserved using techniques and materials that demonstrated advanced preparation and technical expertise. The preserved head was then transported to Constantinople through a route that had obviously been planned in advance, with stopping points, security arrangements, and diplomatic protocols already established. When it arrived at the Ottoman court, Sultan Mehmed II was prepared to receive it in a formal ceremony that had been planned to maximize the psychological impact on both domestic and international audiences. The symbolic importance of this trophy presentation cannot be overstated. The public display of Vlad's severed head in the Ottoman capital was designed to send a clear message to European rulers about the futility of resistance to Ottoman expansion, but it also served domestic political purposes by demonstrating the Sultan's personal triumph over his most persistent and embarrassing enemy. But even more disturbing than the mutilation of Vlad's corpse was the speed and comprehensiveness with which his political legacy was being systematically erased. Orders went out immediately to remove all of Vlad's appointments from positions of authority throughout the Wallachian government and military establishment. His personal property was seized and redistributed according to lists that had obviously been prepared in advance. His known supporters were identified using information that could only have come from extensive surveillance operations and were marked for elimination, exile, or political neutralization. The entire administrative structure that Vlad had built during his 3 separate reigns was being methodically dismantled by people who clearly had detailed knowledge of how it functioned, who controlled it, and where its vulnerabilities could be most effectively exploited. This was not the random destruction that might follow a spontaneous rebellion, but the systematic implementation of a comprehensive plan for governmental reorganization that had been developed by experts with access to inside information. The installation of Basarab Laiota as the new Prince of Wallachia occurred within days of Vlad's death, far too quickly for this to have been a spontaneous selection made in response to unexpected circumstances. Laiota had obviously been chosen and prepared for this role months earlier, and he immediately began implementing policies that demonstrated extensive prior consultation with Ottoman advisors and detailed knowledge of Ottoman administrative preferences. The new prince's first official acts included the signing of treaties and agreements that had clearly been negotiated before Vlad's death, the appointment of officials who had obviously been selected in advance, and the implementation of administrative changes that required the kind of detailed planning, that could not have been improvised in the immediate aftermath of a political crisis. The boyars who had facilitated Vlad's assassination were rewarded exactly as they had been promised during the months of conspiracy planning. They retained their lands and traditional privileges, and many received additional wealth and expanded authority as compensation for their cooperation in the operation. But their rewards were carefully managed by their Ottoman patrons, who were determined to ensure that the new political arrangement would serve Ottoman strategic interests rather than boyar personal ambitions. The efficiency and comprehensiveness of these changes provided definitive proof that Vlad's death had not been an accidental byproduct of military operations or a spontaneous act of rebellion by discontented subordinates. It had been the central objective of a carefully coordinated conspiracy involving Ottoman intelligence services, boyar traitors, and international political arrangements that represented one of the most sophisticated covert operations in medieval European history. Within a single week of Vlad's death, the entire political landscape of Wallachia had been transformed in ways that effectively ended the principality's independence and integrated it into the Ottoman administrative system. This transformation was so complete and so rapidly implemented that it could only have been the result of months of careful planning by people with access to the highest levels of both Wallachian and Ottoman governmental structures. Even as the conspirators who had orchestrated Vlad the Impaler's assassination were working frantically to cover up the true circumstances of his death, the transformation of the historical figure into a supernatural legend was already beginning with a momentum that they could neither control nor predict. The very brutality and mystery surrounding his death provided perfect material for the kind of folklore that would eventually inspire centuries of vampire stories and supernatural horror tales. The public decapitation of Vlad's corpse and the ceremonial display of his severed head in Constantinople created an immediate sense of cosmic injustice and unfinished business that medieval European imagination found absolutely irresistible. In the religious and cultural context of 15th century Europe, the proper treatment of royal corpses was believed to be essential for the peaceful rest of the deceased's soul and for the spiritual health of the entire political community. The deliberate mutilation of Vlad's body suggested to popular imagination that his spirit might not be able to find peace in death and might therefore return to seek vengeance against those who had wronged him. The Ottoman decision to display Vlad's head as a public trophy, while serving immediate political and psychological purposes, backfired in ways that the Sultan's advisors had not anticipated. Rather than demonstrating the futility of resistance to Ottoman power and discouraging future rebellion, the gruesome spectacle generated widespread sympathy for Vlad throughout Christian Europe and horror at the treatment he had received from both his Islamic enemies and his Christian betrayers. European observers began to portray Vlad not as a defeated tyrant, whose death had freed the region from oppression, but as a martyred defender of Christendom whose brutal assassination demanded vengeance from God and from faithful Christians throughout the continent. The fact that he had been betrayed by his own nobles added an additional layer of moral outrage that resonated powerfully with audiences who understood the sacred nature of feudal loyalty obligations. The deliberate mystery surrounding the exact circumstances of his death provided extraordinarily fertile ground for supernatural speculation and mythological elaboration. Because the official accounts were obviously sanitized propaganda, and because the true facts were being systematically concealed by people with strong motives for deception, storytellers throughout Europe were free to invent increasingly dramatic and supernatural explanations for what had really happened in those forests near Bucharest. Within a single generation of his death, stories were circulating throughout Central and Western Europe, suggesting that Vlad had not truly died in any conventional sense, but had instead been transformed by his exposure to extreme evil and his experience of ultimate betrayal into something beyond normal human mortality. These tales drew creatively on both Orthodox Christian concepts of damnation and spiritual corruption, and on much older pagan beliefs about the restless dead who returned from beyond the grave to torment the living and to seek vengeance against their enemies. The geographical isolation of Wallachia, following the Ottoman conquest and the political chaos that characterized the region for decades after Vlad's death, meant that accurate information about his actual reign and death became increasingly difficult for Western European chroniclers to obtain. Working from second-hand accounts, deliberate misinformation provided by various political factions, and their own cultural assumptions about Eastern European politics, these writers created increasingly fantastical narratives about Vlad's life and death that bore progressively less resemblance to historical reality. The cover-up operation that had been carefully designed to protect the Boyar conspirators from legal and political consequences inadvertently contributed to the supernatural interpretation of Vlad's story in ways that the conspirators had never anticipated. By systematically concealing the true circumstances of his death, and by promoting obviously false alternative explanations, the Boyars had created exactly the kind of historical mystery that popular culture inevitably transforms into legend and myth. The more aggressively they tried to control the narrative surrounding Vlad's death, the more they encouraged speculation about what they were trying so desperately to hide. Their very efforts to suppress the truth became evidence, in the minds of many observers, that the truth was too horrible or too supernatural to be openly acknowledged. By the early 16th century, less than 50 years after his death, Vlad the Impaler had already become less a historical figure than a literary and cultural archetype, the tyrant whose cruelty had transformed him into something beyond human evil, whose betrayal and death had unleashed supernatural forces that continue to threaten the living. German pamphlets and broadsheets, representing some of the earliest examples of mass media propaganda in European history, spread lurid tales of his brutality while hinting at supernatural explanations for his extraordinary power and his ultimate fate. These early printed materials were wildly popular throughout Central and Western Europe, establishing many of the narrative themes and supernatural elements that would later appear in more sophisticated literary works. The combination of political intrigue, extreme violence, betrayal, mysterious death, and supernatural resurrection provided all the elements that popular entertainment has always found irresistible. The irony is that this literary and cultural transformation achieved something that all of Vlad's political and military efforts had completely failed to accomplish. It made him genuinely immortal in human consciousness and cultural memory. While his desperate attempts to maintain Wallachian independence had failed utterly, while his military innovations had been quickly forgotten, and while the men who betrayed him had successfully erased his immediate political legacy, the legend born from his horrible death would survive and evolve for centuries. The vampiric associations that would eventually make Vlad one of the most famous and recognizable figures in world literature were already implicit in the stories that began circulating within decades of his assassination. The combination of his well-documented reputation for extreme cruelty, the mysterious and violent circumstances of his death, the deliberate mutilation of his corpse, and the political chaos and moral corruption that followed his elimination provided all the essential elements that popular imagination needed to transform a medieval political conspiracy into a supernatural horror story that would transcend its original historical context. The horrible death of Vlad the Impaler in December 1476 was not the result of heroic combat or tragic accident. It was the culmination of one of the most sophisticated political conspiracies in medieval European history. The man who had terrorized the Ottoman Empire and inspired centuries of vampire legends was ultimately destroyed not by foreign enemies, but by the very men who had pledged to serve him. The Boyar conspiracy that killed Vlad represented the triumph of cynical pragmatism over idealistic resistance. The nobles who betrayed him had calculated that their personal survival and prosperity were more important than Wallachian independence, and they were probably right. Most of them did survive the political transition and retained their wealth and positions under Ottoman rule, at least initially. But their victory came at a cost that extended far beyond Vlad's personal fate. The assassination eliminated the last ruler who had been willing and able to resist Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe. After Vlad's death, the transformation of the region into Ottoman administrative districts proceeded rapidly and with little effective opposition. The conspiracy also revealed the fundamental weakness of medieval political systems based on personal loyalty and feudal obligation. When economic and military pressures became severe enough, even the most sacred oaths of allegiance became negotiable commodities that could be bought and sold by the highest bidder. The cover-up operation that followed Vlad's assassination demonstrated the sophisticated propaganda techniques that were becoming common in late medieval European politics. The ability to coordinate false narratives across multiple audiences and jurisdictions showed that political deception was becoming a professional skill rather than an improvised response to crisis. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Vlad's death was its contribution to the legend that would make him immortal in popular culture. The mystery surrounding his assassination, combined with the brutal treatment of his corpse and the supernatural elements that were already associated with his reputation, created the perfect foundation for the vampire stories that would eventually make him one of the most famous figures in world literature. The forests near Bucharest, where Vlad met his end, have long since grown over the site of his betrayal. The Ottoman Empire that his enemies served has itself passed into history. The Boyar families who conspired against him have been forgotten by everyone except historians. But the legend born from his horrible death continues to evolve and adapt, ensuring that Vlad the Impaler remains more alive in death than he ever was in life. In the end, the men who betrayed Vlad achieved their immediate objectives. They survived, they prospered, and they eliminated a ruler whose policies threatened their interests. But they also created something far more powerful and enduring than anything Vlad had accomplished through political or military means. They transformed a defeated medieval prince into an immortal monster whose story would be told for centuries after their own names had been forgotten. The horrible death of Vlad the Impaler was both the end of a particular historical moment and the beginning of a legend that transcended the political circumstances that created it. The man who had tried desperately to control his legacy through fear and force would discover that the most enduring power often belongs to those who have lost everything else, including their lives.